Imagine this. It's the spring of 1453. A city stands on a peninsula overlooking the Bosporus, surrounded by walls so thick and so legendary that for over 1,000 years, enemies have tried to break through them and failed. This is Constantinople, the greatest city in the medieval world. It's the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which technically traces its lineage all the way back to ancient Rome. But everything is about to change. On May 29th, after 53 days of relentless bombardment and hand-to-hand combat, these walls fall. The last emperor dies fighting, and a civilization that lasted nearly 1,500 years simply ceases to exist. This is the story of how one city's destruction changed the entire course of history. Let's talk about what made Constantinople so special in the first place. The city was founded by Roman Emperor Constantine the Great back in 324 AD. He basically looked at the entire Roman Empire and thought, you know what? I need a new capital. Somewhere on the edge of Europe and Asia, somewhere that can control trade between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. He chose Byzantium, a city that had already existed for about 1,000 years at that point. He renamed it Constantinople, literally the city of Constantine. And for over 1,100 years, this city was absolutely unbeatable. The reason was simple: geography and walls. Constantinople sits on a peninsula with water on 3 sides, so enemies could only really attack from one direction. But that direction was protected by the Theodosian Walls, built in the 5th century. These were engineering masterpieces: multiple walls, stone layers that could absorb cannon fire, towers spaced perfectly for defense. For centuries, every army that attacked Constantinople failed. Arabs tried in the 670s. They failed. The Crusaders came in the 1300s and actually managed to briefly occupy the city, but that was because of a gate that was accidentally left open, not because they breached the walls. The walls were legendary. They were called the Great Wall of Europe. They were supposed to be impenetrable. But by the 1500s, Constantinople was not the powerhouse it once was. The Byzantine Empire had been declining for centuries. The Ottomans, a rising Turkish military power, had been slowly conquering Byzantine territories piece by piece. Wars, internal corruption, plague, economic collapse, all of it had drained the empire. The population of Constantinople itself had plummeted. In the 12th century, the city had about 400,000 people. By 1453, that number had dropped to somewhere between 40 and 50,000. Entire neighborhoods inside the walls were just abandoned fields. The empire was a shadow of what it used to be. It basically consisted of Constantinople and maybe a few surrounding areas. It was no longer an empire. It was a city-state trying to survive. Enter Sultan Mehmed II. This guy was 21 years old, and he had absolutely no patience for the Byzantine holdouts in Constantinople. His father had tried to take the city before and failed. Mehmed was determined to finish the job. He spent years preparing. He built fortresses along the Bosphorus to cut off any escape or resupply routes. He assembled an absolutely massive army. Modern historians estimate it was between 60 and 80,000 troops. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were scraping together every able-bodied person they could find. They had maybe 5,000 to 7,000 defenders. They were outnumbered by a factor of 10 to 1. But here's where it gets really interesting. Mehmed hired a Hungarian engineer and gunsmith named Urban. This guy was a genius with cannons. Mehmed asked him, "Can you build a cannon powerful enough to break through the walls of Constantinople?" Urban said yes. He promised to create cannons so powerful that they could shatter not just the walls of Constantinople, but the very walls of Babylon itself. And he was not exaggerating. The largest cannon Mehmed brought to Constantinople was absolutely massive, 9 meters long, a mouth 1 meter across. It fired stone balls weighing 500 kilos. Each shot took forever to load and aim, maybe 7 shots per day, but when it hit the walls, entire sections would crumble. The Theodosian Walls had withstood armies for over 1,000 years, but they had never faced artillery like this. The siege began on April 6, 1453. The Ottoman cannons started pounding away at the walls relentlessly. The Byzantines did everything they could. They repaired sections at night, they fired back with their small cannons, they even launched surprise attacks against Ottoman positions outside the walls. But they were fighting a losing battle. Every night, the Ottomans repaired their positions, adjusted their cannons, and prepared for the next day's assault. The defenders knew they were trapped. They sent desperate pleas to Western Europe, asking for help. They contacted the Pope. They contacted Venice, Genoa, Hungary. But Europe was a mess. France and England were fighting the 100 Years' War. Spain was dealing with the Reconquista. The Holy Roman Empire was tearing itself apart with internal wars. Nobody had the ability or the willingness to help Constantinople. On May 29th, after 53 grueling days, the Ottoman forces made a final assault. The walls had been pounded so much that there were numerous breaches. The defenders were exhausted. They had barely slept in weeks. The Ottomans poured through the damaged walls and into the city. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the streets. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, made a decision. Rather than surrender, he stripped off his imperial regalia and threw himself into the fighting. According to accounts, he died on the walls with his name unknown, buried beneath other corpses. The city's defenders fought to the absolute end, but it was hopeless. By the end of the day, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans. What happened next was chaotic. Nearly 4,000 people were killed in the siege itself. Another 50,000 were captured and enslaved. The city was looted, buildings were destroyed. But Sultan Mehmed, he did something unexpected. He issued an edict guaranteeing the safety of the Christians who remained. He allowed them to keep their church and their faith as long as they recognized Ottoman rule. He basically said, "This is my capital now. I'm going to rebuild it. I'm going to make it the center of the Ottoman Empire." And he did. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque. The city's name gradually changed from Constantinople to Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for nearly 1,500 years, officially ceased to exist. But what was the actual impact of this one event? How did it change the world? Well, first, it marked the end of an era. The fall of Constantinople is often considered the moment when the Middle Ages ended and the early modern period began. For centuries, Constantinople had been the bulwark of Christendom against Islamic expansion. It had stood as a barrier. Once it fell, the Ottoman Empire had a clear path to expand into Europe. There were no more obstacles. Over the next century and a half, the Ottomans would conquer territories all the way to the gates of Vienna. The religion and politics of Eastern Europe would be fundamentally shaped by this conquest. Second, it forced a massive migration of Greek scholars and intellectuals. Many Byzantine refugees fled to Western Europe, carrying with them manuscripts, knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman culture, and Byzantine scholarship. This actually contributed significantly to the European Renaissance. The intellectual revival of Europe in the 15th and 1600s was partly fueled by Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest. Third, it closed off trade routes. The Ottomans now controlled all the major pathways between Europe and Asia. This forced Europeans to desperately seek alternative routes to Asia, which led directly to the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492, partly because Europeans needed new routes to reach Asian spices and goods. The Ottoman control of old routes made those expeditions necessary. The fall of Constantinople is a perfect example of how one moment can ripple through centuries of history. A city falls, an empire ends, a young sultan takes over, and the entire trajectory of world history shifts. Borders change, religions change, economies transform. It all flows from that one siege in 1453. That's why